Kimballton, Iowa, October 1898. The air held the sharp, clean edge of coming frost, and the cottonwood leaves had turned a brittle, luminous gold. On the vast, rolling prairie, the season for building was closing fast. Most homesteaders were chinking the last gaps in their log walls, stacking firewood into mountains that dwarfed their cabins, and banking earth against their foundations. But Søren Nyholm was doing something else entirely. His 18 by 24-foot log cabin was already finished, a perfectly respectable structure of hewn oak logs that sat squarely on its stone footings. And now he was tearing up the earth around it. He laid a new, second foundation of fieldstone, a perfect rectangle 4 feet out from his cabin walls on every side. Upon this he began erecting a flimsy-looking shell of rough-sawn pine planks, a structure that looked for all the world like a cheap, oversized shed. It had no windows. Its lean-to roof was angled to tuck just under the eaves of the main cabin. It was, to the eyes of his neighbors, the strangest and most foolish act of construction they had ever witnessed. Cornelius Whitmore, the Audubon County land assessor, paused his buggy on the rise overlooking Nyholm's claim. He was a man who understood the geometry of survival on the prairie, and this geometry was wrong. "What in God's name is that Dane building now?" he muttered to his driver. Down in the settlement, the consensus was already forming. Jens Petersen, whose own cabin was a model of sturdy efficiency, shook his head. "It's madness. He's building a barn to house his house." Lars Anderson, who had helped Søren raise the main cabin's ridgepole, felt a pang of second-hand embarrassment. The work was quickly dubbed Nyholm's Folly. The man had built a solid home, and now he was wrapping it in a wooden box. It was wasteful. It was ugly. And everyone agreed it was the act of a man who was either foolish or had simply lost his mind to the prairie's isolating winds. What did this quiet Jutland carpenter, a man whose hands knew the curved planks of fishing boats and the relentless North Sea wind, understand about the physics of prairie cold? That seasoned homesteaders, men who had raised a dozen cabins from Iowa soil, had missed? Their laughter and mockery would echo across the fields for a few short weeks. The validation of Søren's strange idea would last for generations. Before we see how this bizarre structure performed in the brutal winter that was already gathering its forces on the northern horizon, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell for notifications. We explore the forgotten genius of frontier innovators, and I promise you will learn something fundamental about thermal insulation in this story that is as true today as it was in 1898. We rely on your support to continue bringing these histories to light, and let us know in the comments, have you ever seen an old building with a strange feature you couldn't quite explain? Søren Nyholm was not a frontiersman. He was not a farmer, not a logger, not a sodbuster. His hands, calloused and knowing, were shaped by a different world. He was a clink carpenter from the wind-scoured coast of Jutland in Denmark. He did not think in terms of straight lines and right angles, but in the subtle compound curves of clinker-built hulls, where overlapping oak strakes created a shell of immense strength and flexibility. His trade was not in felling trees, but in shaping them to shed water and wind. The scent of his former life was not of prairie dust and wood smoke, but of hot tar on rope, of salt spray, and the cool, damp air inside the Jiski drift sheds, the double-walled livestock shelters he had built along the coast. These were pragmatic structures, designed to keep sheep and cattle from freezing during the damp, penetrating chill of a Danish winter, and their secret was not in the thickness of a single wall, but in the space between two. He had brought his wife, Mette, and their 2 small children, Anders and Kirsten, to the Danish colony in Kimballton with the promise of land and a new beginning. But their first winter in Iowa, spent in a hastily built, conventional log cabin, had been a lesson in a new kind of cold. It was not the damp chill of the sea. It was a dry, predatory cold that seemed to drain the very life from wood and iron. He had watched his neighbor, Jens Petersen, swing a crank on his new Ford water pump, only to see the cast-iron collar split with a sound like a pistol shot in the 20-degree air. In the small-frame church, the baptismal font had a skin of ice, and the pastor's pen, filled with fresh ink to enter a name in the church register, froze solid to the nib mid-signature. A heavy wool overcoat, left on a vestry peg, had become so brittle that when the pastor took it down, the collar cracked and tore like old paper. That winter, Søren's family had huddled around their stove, burning a terrifying amount of wood, yet the cold was a constant presence. Metta's fingers were perpetually numb, and the children slept in their coats under a mountain of quilts, their breath pluming in the air of their own bedroom. Søren had vowed, with a quiet and unshakable resolve, that his family would never endure such a winter again. The failure of the conventional log cabin was not a failure of craftsmanship. The homesteaders of Iowa were expert builders. They could hew logs to a perfect fit and chink the gaps with a mud and moss mixture that was nearly airtight. The problem was a fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy. The enemy was not simply low temperature, it was heat transfer. A standard cabin wall, even one made of 10-inch thick oak logs, has an R value, a measure of its resistance to heat flow, of only about 10 or 12. On a calm day, this was adequate, but the Iowa prairie was rarely calm. When a 30-mile-per-hour wind at 30 degrees Fahrenheit slammed into that wall, it created a phenomenon called wind-driven convection. The wind acted like a thief, stripping heat from the outer surface of the logs at a ferocious rate. The cold then conducted through the solid wood to the interior surface. Inside, the family stoked the fire, burning through precious cords of wood. The stove would glow red-hot, creating a bubble of survivable warmth in the center of the room. But inches from the walls, the air was frigid. Any moisture in the air, from breath, from a kettle, from washing, would instantly condense on the interior walls and freeze, coating them in a layer of crystalline frost. The cabins were, in effect, expensive, labor-intensive refrigerators, trying to stay warm by placing a massive fire inside. It was a losing battle. The settlers were fighting a war of attrition against the laws of physics, and their primary weapon, more firewood, was a resource that could and often did run out long before the winter did. They were trying to heat the entire state of Iowa, one log at a time. The problem wasn't the fire, it was the container. Søren's project began the moment the ground thawed in the spring of 1898. He spent the summer building his family's 18 by 24-foot cabin, a task at which he was competent, if not exceptional. His neighbors saw nothing unusual, but in September, when others were harvesting, he began the work that would earn him their ridicule. He paced out 4 feet from the foundation of his finished home and began digging a new trench. He laid a new, continuous stone footing, creating a perimeter around his entire house. The mockery started then, in earnest. "Søren's building a racetrack for his chickens," someone joked at the general store. He ignored them. On the new footing, he erected a simple post and beam frame. He sheathed it with the cheapest pine planks he could find, creating a tall, windowless outer wall that completely encircled his home. He built a simple lean-to roof on this outer structure, carefully sloping it so that it tucked neatly just beneath the eaves of his cabin's main roof. The result was bizarre. His sturdy, respectable log cabin now sat inside a crude, oversized wooden box, like a jewel placed in a packing crate. The 4-foot gap between the inner log wall and the outer plank wall was a dark, uninviting corridor. It was at this stage that Cornelius Whitmore paid his official visit. The land assessor's job was to ensure homesteaders were meeting the requirements of the 1862 Act, residing on the land and making improvements. Whitmore, a man of ledgers and regulations, saw not an innovation, but a violation. He walked the perimeter of the strange structure, his boots crunching on wood shavings. "Mr. Nyholm," he began, his tone formal and edged with impatience. "I am required to document all improvements for my report to the county land office. What precisely is the purpose of this addition?" Søren, who was fitting a door on the north side of the outer shell, paused his work. "It is a wall," he said simply, his Danish accent thickening the words. Whitmore's pen was poised over his notepad. "It appears to be a secondary outbuilding attached directly to the primary dwelling. It substantially increases the footprint of your claimed structures. Under the terms of the Homestead Act, all significant improvements must be declared and registered. An unregistered structure of this scale, well, the land office in Audubon could see it as an attempt to obscure the value of your parcel. They could reclassify your filing next April. Frankly, you could lose your claim over this." The threat was real. Losing the claim meant losing everything. Any other man might have argued or pleaded or begun tearing the structure down. Søren simply looked at Whitmore, his gaze calm and steady. "It is not an outbuilding," he repeated. "It is part of the wall." Whitmore scribbled a furious note. "I'll record it as an unclassified auxiliary structure. I advise you to have it registered or remove it." He turned and left, convinced he was dealing with a stubborn fool. The final step was the most bewildering of all. Søren purchased dozens of wagon loads of oat straw, the cheap, fluffy byproduct of the recent harvest. For days, he and a reluctant Meta hauled the straw, packing it into the 4-foot cavity between the two walls. They stuffed it in from the top, using long poles to tamp it down until the entire gap from the stone footing to the eaves was a solid, tightly packed mass of dry straw. He had enclosed his home in a 48-inch thick blanket of agricultural waste. His wife Meta stood back and looked at the finished project. The house she had moved into was gone, hidden inside this windowless, featureless monolith. 2 doors, one on the north side and one on the south, were the only openings in the outer shell. "It looks like a great wooden box, Søren," she said, a nervous tremor in her voice. Then she put a hand on his arm. "But I trust you." The mockery from the town was at its peak. Nyholm's Folly was now Nyholm's haystack. The children in the settlement whispered that he was so afraid of winter he was trying to bury his house. But Søren Nyholm wasn't burying his house. He was arming it. The problem, as Søren understood it from his experience with the drift sheds of Jutland, wasn't the cold itself. The problem was air, or more specifically, moving air. Air in motion or convection is a relentless thief of heat. A person can survive in still 0-degree air for a considerable time. But in 0-degree air moving at 30 miles per hour, the wind chill plummets to a life-threatening 45 degrees. The moving air molecules constantly scrub warmth from any exposed surface. The log cabins of his neighbors were being scrubbed of their heat by the prairie wind. Still air, however, is one of the best insulators on the planet. The tiny pockets of air trapped in a goose-down feather are what make it so warm. The genius of Søren's design was twofold: a brilliant 1-2 punch against the laws of thermodynamics. First, the outer plank shed served as the primary windbreak. It took the full kinetic force of the Iowa winter. The 30-mile-per-hour gales crashed against its cheap pine boards and stopped. In the 4-foot cavity between the outer shed and the inner cabin, the air became almost perfectly still. He had defeated the enemy of convection. But even still air will circulate on its own when there's a temperature difference. The air near the cold outer wall would sink, and the air near the warmer inner wall would rise, creating a slow, heat-sapping convective loop within the cavity. This was the second and more brilliant part of his plan, the straw. By packing the 4-foot gap with dense oat straw, he trapped the air. He created millions upon millions of microscopic air pockets, each one a tiny barrier to heat transfer. The straw prevented any convective loops from forming. He had created a massive 48-inch thick layer of what modern builders call super insulation. Let's look at the numbers. The R value of dry packed oat straw is approximately R3 per inch. With a 48-inch gap, Søren had added an astonishing R144 layer of insulation to his home. A standard 10-inch log wall, as we noted, is about R12. Søren's total wall system was now over R150. A typical modern home today is built with R19 walls. Søren's cabin was, in thermal terms, an armored bunker. A conventional cabin in a polar outbreak might hemorrhage heat at a rate of 42,000 BTUs per hour, requiring a large, roaring fire to keep the interior survivable. Søren's cabin, with its immense thermal resistance, would lose heat at a trickle, perhaps only 6,000 BTUs per hour. This meant a tiny potbelly stove, fed with a few logs every few hours, could easily maintain a comfortable 68 degrees inside. He wasn't just saving wood, he was changing the entire equation of prairie survival. That November, the winter arrived not as a gradual cooling, but as an invasion. A polar outbreak plunged down from Canada, and for 12 consecutive nights the temperature in Audubon County did not rise above 30 degrees Fahrenheit. A relentless 30-mile-per-hour wind blew from the north, stripping the insulating layer of snow from the open fields and scouring the walls of every building. It was a winter that would be spoken of for decades, a true test of preparedness and endurance. In Kimballton, the plumes of smoke from the chimneys of the log cabins told the story. They were thick, dark, and constant. Inside, life had been reduced to a grim circle around the stove. Families burned through their winter wood piles at a terrifying rate. The Petersons were already halfway through their entire winter supply by Christmas. Windows were sealed, with an inch of opaque ice on the inside, blocking what little light the winter sun offered. Every nailhead in the walls was a point of white frost, a tiny thermal bridge, bleeding precious warmth out onto the prairie. The cabins were filled with the constant nagging sound of the wind, a low moan that found its way through every tiny crack in the chinking. But at the Nyholm homestead, there was silence. The outer shed took the full fury of the wind, and inside the inner cabin, the air was profoundly still. The only sound was the gentle crackle of a small fire in the potbelly stove. Søren would add a single small log every 3 or 4 hours. The total wood consumption was, as he had calculated, about 1/6 of his neighbor's. His woodpile, which the others had mocked as pitifully small, now seemed impossibly large. This was a place where the cold had been so thoroughly defeated that normal life could continue. Mette kneaded dough for bread on the wooden kitchen table, her hands and the dough staying warm and pliable. The children, Anders and Kirsten, were not bundled in layers of wool. They sat on the floor playing with carved wooden toys, dressed in simple cotton shirts. They slept soundly under a single quilt each, in a room that was comfortably warm, not merely survivable. The air didn't smell of acrid smoke and damp wool. It smelled of baking bread and fresh coffee. It was an island of impossible, domestic normalcy in a sea of frozen misery. The ultimate proof of Søren's success sat on a simple shelf on the north wall of the inner cabin, the coldest wall in any normal house. It was a ceramic crock filled with rødgrød, a traditional Danish red fruit pudding Mette had made for the coming fastelavn festival. The sweet, smooth pudding, a vibrant taste of summer, sat there day after day, remaining perfectly liquid, its surface gleaming in the lantern light. It was just warm enough from the ambient temperature of the room not to set. At Jens Peterson's cabin just a half-mile away, A pot of water left on the edge of their stove, the warmest place in their house, had frozen solid an hour after the fire was banked for the night. One family lived in a house, the other lived in a freezer that happened to contain a fire. In early February, with the polar outbreak still locked in place, Cornelius Whitmore had to make his rounds. It was a grim duty, serving notices of tax delinquency and checking on the welfare of isolated homesteaders. The cold was a physical enemy. His sled, pulled by two stout horses, moved slowly over the frozen, wind-scoured landscape. As he approached the rise overlooking Søren Nyholm's claim, he saw no plume of smoke from the chimney, only a faint, shimmering heat haze. His first thought was that the family had frozen. He urged his horses down the lane toward the silent, box-like structure. Just as he reached the gate, the front runner of his sled, made brittle by the relentless cold, struck a frozen rut. It shattered with a sharp crack that echoed in the deathly still air. Whitmore was stranded. He was miles from town. The wind was a physical force that stole his breath, and the temperature was low enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. Cursing, he wrapped his scarf tighter and trudged towards the only shelter in sight, Nyholm's Folly. He pulled open the heavy plank door on the north side of the outer shed and braced himself for the Arctic blast he expected to find inside. Instead, he stepped into a world of absolute calm. The wind died instantly. It was utterly silent. The air in the 4-foot corridor was cold, yes, but it was a dead, harmless cold, lacking the vicious bite of the wind. He was standing in the buffer zone. He looked down the long, straw-packed corridor. On one side was the thin pine planking of the outer wall, visibly frosted. On the other was the inner log cabin. He expected that log wall to be a mirror of the outer one, coated in a thick layer of rime ice, as cold as a tombstone. He took off a thick leather glove, his fingers already aching with cold. Driven by a grim curiosity, a need to understand the foolishness or genius before him, he placed his bare palm flat against the chinked logs of the inner cabin. The sensation was a physical shock. It was not cold. It was not even neutral. The wall was warm, impossibly, wonderfully warm. It felt like a sun-baked stone, like the door of a bread oven a few hours after the baking was done. He could feel the gentle, radiant heat of the life inside, a steady, calm warmth that was contained by the straw-packed shell. He pressed his face closer and could smell the faint, unmistakable scent of coffee. He could hear the murmur of a child's voice. In that moment, the entire, brilliant reality of what Søren had built crashed down on him. The inner cabin door opened, and Søren Nyholm stood there, silhouetted against the warm light. He saw Whitmore, his hand pressed flat against the wall, his face a mask of pale astonishment. "Mr. Whitmore, are you all right?" Søren asked, his voice calm. Whitmore pulled his hand back as if the wall were hot. He stared at it, then at Søren's simple, unadorned home. The county land assessor, the man of rules and right angles, finally understood the elegant, world-changing physics in front of him. He looked from the outer plank wall to the warm inner log wall, at the straw packed between them. "My God, Nyholm," he said, his voice raspy with cold and awe. "You didn't build a wall. You built a silence." Søren gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "The wind cannot steal what it cannot touch," he said. He gestured with his head. "Come inside. Meta has coffee." Cornelius Whitmore returned to Audubon 2 days later, after Søren helped him fashion a new sled runner. He did not file a complaint about an unregistered improvement. Instead, he walked into the general store, the unofficial heart of the community, and told everyone what he had felt. He described pressing his bare hand against a log wall in 30 below weather and feeling the warmth of a living room. He spoke not with the authority of a land assessor, but with the reverence of a convert. The laughter about Nyholm's folly died that day. It was replaced by a wave of quiet, respectful curiosity. The story spread through the close-knit Danish community. A visitor from Cedar Falls, Iowa, was in Kimballton that March and heard the tale directly from a sheepish Jens Petersen. A writer for Danish, the prominent Danish-American newspaper based in Cedar Falls, he saw the profound importance of Nyholm's innovation. He interviewed Søren, who, with his typical modesty, sketched out the design on a piece of butcher paper. In the March 1899 edition, the paper ran a full-page feature complete with a diagram. The Nyholm method, a double wall for prairie homesteads. It explained the principle of the windbreak, the still air gap, and the straw insulation. The article was a sensation. By the autumn of 1899, 7 other Danish-American farm families across Audubon and Shelby counties had built their own Nyholm wraps around their existing cabins. The following winter, a milder one by comparison, they reported burning less than a third of their usual firewood. The idea worked, and its practicality was its gospel. Søren Nyholm, with his Jutland boat-building knowledge and his memory of coastal livestock sheds, had stumbled upon, or rather reapplied, a fundamental principle of modern high-performance construction. He did it nearly a century before the terms super-insulated envelope or double-stud wall would enter the architectural lexicon. Modern building science uses dense-packed cellulose or fiberglass insulation, advanced air-sealing tapes, and computer modeling to achieve what Søren achieved with pine planks and oat straw. His creation was a direct ancestor of the modern passive house, a building so efficient it requires almost no active heating. He was a man decades ahead of his time, not because of academic theory, but because of practical, inherited wisdom applied to a new and brutal problem. There is a lesson in the quiet genius of Søren Nyholm that transcends building science. The other settlers saw the winter as an enemy to be fought, a force to be met with a bigger force. Their solution was a direct assault, a thicker wall, a bigger fire. It was a battle of attrition they were destined to lose. Søren's solution was indirect, elegant, and born of a different philosophy. He did not try to build a stronger wall to fight the winter. He built a second, weaker wall and declared the space between them to be the true battlefield. He didn't fight the cold. He simply created a space where the physics of cold were rendered ineffective. The genius was not in the wall itself, but in the gap. He understood that true resilience is not always about strength, but about intelligence. He didn't build a wall against winter. He wrapped his cabin in a second wall and packed straw between them, creating a zone of profound stillness where his family and his culture could quietly thrive. If you found this story of quiet ingenuity and vindication inspiring, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of forgotten history and practical genius. Your support is what allows us to keep this history alive. And please, comment below, what's the cleverest low-tech solution to a big problem you've ever come across in your own life? Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. While the techniques and principles are based on real historical practices, the specific characters, names, and events depicted are fictional. The application of any building techniques, historical or modern, should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.